Hello. I'm recording this the day after Candlemas, and now that the darkest quarter of the year is behind us and we're a bit more aware that the days are getting a little longer, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the morning light and what it meant to C.S. Lewis. Lewis loved the early morning. His friend George Sayer, who wrote a biography called Jack, tells us how Lewis loved to walk in the garden before breakfast. I can thoroughly recommend this biography, by the way. Lewis sometimes stayed with Sayer, where he lived in Malvern, and it was a very warm first-person account, maybe a little biased, but good. In his theological book, The Four Loves, Lewis says, "Say your prayers in a garden early, ignoring steadfastly the dew, the birds and the flowers, and you will come away overwhelmed by its freshness and joy." I ought to add that he goes on to say, go there in order to be overwhelmed, and after a certain age, 9 times out of 10, nothing will happen to you. Because if we try to set nature itself up as a religion, it'll just die on us. Delighted descriptions of early morning appear very frequently in his letters. So, for example, he describes to his brother Warney his beloved Addison's Walk that bordered Magdalen College in Oxford, where he enjoyed very much the effects of a clear, still morning sky of pigeon grey, pearl grey, and eastward pale butter colour verging on cream, on a state of partial flood. Or to an American correspondent, Joan Lancaster, he enthuses about a particular winter morning in 1955. This morning the lawns are all grey, with a pale, bright sunshine on them, wonderfully beautiful and somehow exciting. The first beginning of the winter always excites me. It makes me want adventures. When the character Ransom in his novel Perelandra tells us a wood or a morning sky on earth had sometimes been a kind of meal, it's easy to think that this is how Lewis himself had often felt. Morning has a huge symbolic resonance throughout Lewis. When Father Christmas arrives in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, it's not in the middle of the night like in our world, but at daybreak, perhaps as a foretaste of the resurrection which is to come. If you remember later in the book, that long, cold vigil of Susan and Lucy by Aslan's dead body all through the night is broken by birdsong at first and the sinking of the morning star and a little pale light on the horizon at the very end of the world as they look out eastward from the hill of the stone table. And then the skyline slowly reddens and turns gold. At the very moment at which the edge of the sun comes up, the table cracks and Aslan awakes. When the girls dare to turn around, the stone table, like the tomb in Jerusalem on that other resurrection morning, is empty. Under the rising sun, Aslan and the 2 girls play on the hilltop in the sunlight. Aslan roars. And again, in Prince Caspian, we're told that to look out to the sea is to look towards Aslan's land and the morning and the eastern end of the world. And in that story too, when Aslan comes in liberating power, he begins to act at daybreak. "Now," said Aslan, "the moon is setting. Look behind you. There is the dawn beginning." And he draws their attention to the morning about to break. And they see that the light was changing. Low down in the east, Aravir, the morning star of Narnia, gleamed like a little moon. Aslan, who seemed larger than before, lifted his head, shook his mane, and roared. As well as linking the physical event of morning to the resurrection and the victory of Christ through the storytelling, this love of morning often helps conjure up a mood in the characters in the stories. Morning is joyously received. So, for instance, the marsh where Puddleglum lives in the Silver Chair could look rather gloomy in bad weather, but seen under a morning sun with a fresh wind blowing and the air filled with the crying of birds, there was something fine and fresh and clean about its loneliness. The children felt their spirits rise. And this freshness and cleanness of the daybreak that Lewis loved so much conveyed for him the purity of holiness, as well as, I think, a piercing longing and joy. So the novella Fantastes by the Victorian writer George MacDonald, which Lewis said had baptised his imagination when he was 17, had about it a sort of cool morning innocence. And he tells us about it in his autobiography. And he goes on, "I should have been shocked in my teens if anyone had told me that what I learned to love in Fantastes was goodness, the sweet air blowing from the land of righteousness." In his famous Oxford sermon, The Weight of Glory, Lewis talks of the freshness and purity of the morning and the morning star itself, and their prophecies and projections of that beauty, grace and power of which nature is the image. In other words, the freshness and purity of the morning are a picture, a revelation for us of an aspect of God. Nature so often reflects his beauty and grace and power. And one day, he suggests, in Christ, we will be drawn into all of that. The morning passages that I was talking about just now in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe and Prince Caspian have the sun rising at the furthest edge of the world. And Lewis takes this idea to the limit in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, of course, when Caspian and his crew sail there. And in the chapter called The Beginning of the End of the World, there's one of Lewis's greatest morning scenes when the star, Ramandu, and his daughter sing before the rising sun. It's a cold, early morning kind of song, as Lucy puts it. And the day dawns with white skies and a silver shining sea. And then the east turns red and the sun ascends and sends its rays along the banquet table where they are. And the sun is much bigger than usual and far beyond any morning brightness they had ever seen. And it's morning later as well, when the last of the voyagers come to the very edge of the world, and the sun is rising when Reepicheep the mouse goes on alone into Aslan's country. And Eustace, Edmund and Lucy, near where the sky comes down to meet the earth, meet the Lamb, who is Aslan, who is Christ, on the seashore. And come and have breakfast, he says. This cool morning innocence contributes to how Lewis imagines heaven in his book, The Great Divorce, when the characters get out of the bus that's brought them to the borders of heaven. The narrator tells us the light and coolness that drenched me were like those of summer morning, early morning, a minute or two before the sunrise. And in that heavenly light, his fellow passengers seem very insubstantial and ghostly. They're person-shaped stains on the brightness of that air. And the shadows that are the posh clothes of one woman look ghastly in the morning light. You see, the light shows them for what they really are. And they're not ready for heaven. Not yet. And then later on in the magnificent final scene, the sunrise at the end of time, the narrator with his back to the east sees and hears the effect of the ultimate sunrise, which is building behind him. First a rising brightness on the trees and ferns showing suddenly gold, shadows deepening, and there's a heavenly dawn chorus and a sudden clamour of all the animals, and then 10,000 tongues of men and woodland angels, and the wood itself sang. It comes, they sang. And the sun began to rise. The morning, our narrator cries out in fear. And in the last battle, when King Tyrion enters the new Narnia through the stable door, which again represents heaven, it seems like a summer morning. And sometime later, after he's met the kings and queens of Narnia and heard their stories and sampled the fruit of the trees and remonstrated with the dwarfs and met Aslan and witnessed the end of the old Narnia and heard Emeth's tale and Puzzle's tale, it says it still seemed to be early and the morning freshness was in the air. And then at the end, Aslan proclaims, the term is over, the holidays have begun. The dream is ended. This is the morning. In Mere Christianity, Lewis talks about how we can be drawn into Christ, and in Christ we will be offered to his Father. It's the only thing we're made for, he says. And when that happens, the bad dream will be over. It will be morning. In the weight of glory, he talks about the bit in Revelation where God promises to give the one who overcomes the morning star. He says, in one way, of course, God has given us the morning star already. You can go and enjoy the gift on many fine mornings if you get up early enough.